So this is going to be a slightly different video to my normal content, but in order to get a video out in a more timely fashion, I thought I'd try my hand at doing something a little bit more rough and unscripted. So apologies if I end up sounding a little bit drunk and a little bit dazed in this video, but bear with me because this is a topic that I wanted to talk about. Because for those of you that don't know, I'm a product designer. That's what I do for my day job. So solving design and user experience problems is what I do all day. So because of that, I wanted to talk about the new UI because obviously it's right up my alley. And I hadn't really heard many people from my background talk about the UI, its strengths, its weaknesses, and its potential. So yeah, that's what this video is going to be about, and as usual I've broken it into a couple of different sections. So firstly I'm just going to give you an overview, sort of recap how they position the UI, what they said it's supposed to do, what they've said it's supposed to achieve. I'll then talk about what I think looks good, what looks interesting, and what I think it's doing well. Then I'll move on to my questions and concerns, which is probably going to be the longest part of the video because I have quite a few concerns. And then to finish up, I've noticed a few issues which I'd like to point out, and hopefully these are easy fixes and things that can be remedied either shortly after launch or in the not too distant future, and I'll give you my final thoughts on the whole thing. So we'll start off with an overview of the PS5's UI. Now it was presented by the head of platform planning and management, which also look after the product design and user experience. And he has a name which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce because I will butcher it for sure. But he said that it's designed to deliver a next-gen experience, that it would utilize the potential of the platform and deliver a UI or a user experience that we haven't really seen on a console before. He also outlined that they recognize that our time is valuable and that our playtime should be meaningful. So this gives us a rough outline of the goals of this new UI and what they hope to achieve with it. And this is kind of the guideline that I'm going to use to sort of critique the UI based on the small demo that we were given. So this presentation only covered a really small group of features, and specifically new features, things that we haven't seen before. Now they did say that it was a brand new UI specifically built for the PS5 from the ground up. Now I think there's some reading between the lines here. I don't think it's a completely new UI. I think maybe what they're talking about is from a technology point of view, from a back-end point of view, a code point of view, it may be all new, but certainly from a front end, from a UI perspective, from a pattern perspective, there are many patterns that they've reused and similarities from the PS4 menu, which itself was an evolution of the PS3's menu. So yeah, it shares a lot in common with the PS4's UI, and that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of usability. We don't want to have to be relearning absolutely everything. So let's talk about what I liked, some of the things that I thought were good and definitely interesting and showed promise for the long term. First of all, it looks fast, so I don't know if the footage that we saw was unedited. They certainly led us to believe that that was the case, and if so, it looks fast and snappy, and that's really good. I also really liked how the control center worked. Now this was the menu that was brought up by tapping the PS button, and this could be brought up either on the home screen or it can be brought up during gameplay. And if it was brought up during gameplay, it would actually pop up as an overlay and the game would continue running in the background. And I thought this could be quite useful. Obviously, if you're playing an online game, you can't pause, and there'd be lots of different situations where you wouldn't want to obscure the screen so you couldn't see what was going on or jump out of the game into a menu. So having this come up as an overlay is really nice. Another thing I thought looked really cool was picture-in-picture, watching a friend's screen. Now, I don't know how useful this feature will be, but the way that it operated looked quite quick and snappy and unobtrusive. And this seems to be tying in nicely to their kind of whole philosophy of making it more of a social platform. So obviously they talked about the improvements that they've made to the party system and also groups, and that sounds really interesting. Parties have never really been a strong part of the PlayStation experience, so the fact that they're putting a bit more effort and a bit more focus into that is definitely a good thing. Just to go back to the control center, UI, and they talked a lot about the activities feature, which I thought was interesting. I didn't think it was something for everyone, and I'll touch a little bit on this more later on. But I liked the idea that when you brought up a menu while you were playing a game, that it would give you menu options specifically for that game, whether it be tips or information about your progress or trophies that you're close to achieving, that sort of stuff. I really like those sort of contextual menus, and I think that goes a long way towards what they were saying about it being a player-centered design. And that's how they've really positioned this. They've really presented it as a player-centric design, or in product design circles, I guess that's kind of like a user-centered design. But basically the whole concept behind that is that it really puts the user or the player or the person at the center of the experience, and everything should be tailored around their needs and what they want to do and what they want to get out of it. A small feature that they highlighted is voice dictation. So the PS5 controller has a microphone in it, so now you can compose messages and type out text using voice dictation. And all I have to say to that is fuck yes, because typing out using the keyboard on the PlayStation or using the phone app is just super fiddly, so hopefully that makes life a lot easier. So overall, from a features perspective, I think it's trying to do a lot of new things, a lot of new next-gen things, and I think a lot of that's really exciting. But I'm not sure how useful or how much I'll utilize these features. That just sort of remains to be seen. So this seems like a good point to switch track and talk about some of the concerns I have and some of the questions that this presentation sort of brought up. Now, one of the hopes that I had from this new generation is that they would make a more conscious effort when it came to the UI and specifically to the UX. And I've always felt that the games industry, for the most part, have kind of lagged behind other industries when talking about UI. I don't know why that is. There's plenty of money and plenty of talent in games design, but the UIs have always been a bit of a mess. So I mentioned before, they've positioned this as player focused. So as the name suggests, it should focus on the player's needs and preferences. And if that's the case, then what they showed in the demonstration didn't really communicate it all that well. Now, to be fair, there were two features that did seem to put the player first, and that was the in-game activities feature that really sort of tailored the experience or the UI around the player. And I think the Explore screen could do this quite well, but that really remains to be seen in terms of what content is in there and how personalized it is. So I did mention activities from the control panel as something that I thought was interesting or part of the good points. And this was very much a focus of the demo, and it definitely impresses from a technical point of view. But my concern with this is that it only really has value for people who often need help or use guides or are trying to get specific trophies. Like for myself and for a lot of people that I know, I can't see them using this feature much or really at all. And the problem with this is that it tends to add a lot of clutter and visual noise to the UI. So when you open up the control center to find something you're after, you're going to be presented with these big cards full of information that doesn't really relate to you or doesn't really have much value. So based on what they showed us, it's a solution that doesn't look like it will scale very well. And what I mean by that is, like, they had a number of cards in there, but they didn't say, you know, if it maxes out, like if there's a limit to the amount of cards or if it just keeps adding more and more cards, in which case you might be scrolling forever to find the stuff that you want or the stuff that's relevant. This menu, the control center does have a customize option, which is really nice. So potentially you'll be able to customize what shows up. Like if you don't want tips for games to come up or news about that game, then maybe you can hide that content. But it does seem like there may be some issues in terms of how that scales long term. One of the big points that they made early on in the video is that it was designed with a look and feel that would take advantage of 4K displays, which is great if you have a 4K display. But how does this improve the usability? Like, how does having high resolution graphics, 4K graphics, and apparently it's got HDR support, how does that improve the usability of a UI? We saw a lot of use of big images taking up the whole screen. While they look pretty, they don't necessarily make the UI easier to use. In fact, having lots of different competing images all over the screen could ultimately make it harder to use. So I guess my big question with this is, how does it let people focus on the task at hand? How is 4K being used to enhance the experience? And the reason I ask that is because if it's been designed specifically for 4K, how does it then render on 1080p screens? Because a lot of people are going to be running the PS5 on standard HD screens, not 4K screens. And back in the good old days of the PS3, I remember playing Grand Theft Auto 4 on a standard definition TV before I got my first proper HD screen. And I remember that the menus in that weren't properly optimized for standard definition. They were optimized for a HD screen, and all the text was absolutely tiny. Even God of War, which came out a couple of years ago, had the same thing. The text in it was absolutely tiny. I think they had sort of assumed everybody had these massive high-resolution screens and would be able to see this tiny little text. So yeah, that's a concern of mine, that they haven't considered all users in creating this new UI. I guess the other issue with 4K is how does it impact performance? So based on what we saw in the demo, it looked very quick. It looked like menus were loading fast, but if you're streaming in huge assets, obviously big assets take longer times to load. And if it's streaming in assets from the internet, does this affect performance, and how does it work on slower internet connections? So that's the things that stood out to me that were potentially concerning, or that I had additional questions about how they worked, what the strategy was. But there was a couple of things that I saw which, from my perspective, or from a product designer's perspective, really stood out as issues or problems or things that I think need to be fixed, and things that are disappointing, you know, when looking at this as a brand new sort of next gen looking forward UI. So the first and most obvious thing for me is, why are there so many elements without labels? Like, they've used icons in a lot of the menus and throughout the UI that don't have labels. Yeah, this looks super clean and really nice and well designed, but it's objectively harder to use. So not having labels next to icons forces you to remember what these icons represent. Some of these icons are easily recognizable, such as the search being represented by a magnifying glass. I think that's universally understood as the search icon. But then others, like the ellipses, which they've used in some of the card menus, which quite often represents a menu or additional options, aren't immediately clear what they do. I mean, I'm assuming that's what they do, but honestly, who knows? There's also quite a lack of consistency throughout the UI, and what I mean by that is that a lot of it's very flat and has been given the same treatment. So for example, the send button that they've used in the card or the widget or the modal or whatever you want to call it, which lets you send a message or share a screenshot, the buttons in these little cards, it has the same treatment as the text box. So, you know, it could be mistaken as being inactive, or it could be mistaken for being a strange little text box with send in it. I mean, I would think that most people who play PlayStation would be savvy enough to figure this out, but again, it's one of many examples of how the UI forces a unnecessary level of cognitive load onto you, forcing you to remember, oh, in order to do this thing, I need to do this, or in order to find the menu option that I want, it's under this icon that looks like that. I also noticed that in these cards, some of the options kind of sit awkwardly outside of them. So one of them was opened up and there's a little options thing that sits outside of the card, which I'm assuming relates to that card, but it's kind of hard to tell because it's sitting out of it. So is it options for that specific card, or is it different options? It's really hard to tell. Okay, so I talked for a really long time there. I had a lot of opinions. I'm sure quite a lot of them are unpopular. A lot of people seem to think that this UI looks really good, and I think visually it does look good. I don't think it's a dramatic departure from the PS4 menu in terms of its appearance. It's got rounded corners now, like yippee. I think the most impressive thing is that it was fast, and I like that they're really trying to push the envelope with new functionality, new features that we haven't seen before. I think there's a lot of potential for developers to do some really interesting things here. But ultimately, I think it's too early to make a proper assessment whether this is going to be good or bad. The only way that you can really evaluate how good a UI is and how good a user experience is to experience that for yourself and get hands-on with it in a real-life scenario. And what I mean by that is to use it in an actual gaming session. So you boot up the console, you want to go play a game, maybe you want to go check your messages, maybe you want to go check your downloads. Only in that kind of scenario will you get a real understanding of, oh, this UI is really easy and fast to use, or what the fuck, I'm having to deal with all this superfluous information, or it's really slow, or oh damn, my internet's down, half of the menu doesn't work. So ultimately, I think we're just going to have to wait and see what it looks like when it launches. But it was definitely an interesting first sort of glimpse at the direction that they're heading. And I like that at least their mission statement, or at least what they're positioning it as, is player focused. So hopefully they can stick really close to that. But anyway, I'm going to stop rambling. I've talked for way longer than I thought I would. I hope you found this kind of like off-the-cuff brain dump entertaining. Let me know if you thought it was good. If you want to see more of these, drop me a like or let me know in the comments. But otherwise, I've got regular content coming up real soon. So yeah, look forward to that. And yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.